Hi, everybody. How are you?
Very good, Johnny.
All right. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction and familiarization for those of you who aren't familiar with the Black Thriving Initiative. I just wanted to give a little bit of background and orient those of you who may not have heard this kind of presentation before. But just everybody remembers, so in response to the civil unrest that occurred in 2020, then Vice Chancellor Doug Haynes instituted a series of initiatives in the summer of 2020 that were designed to respond to anti-Blackness and treat it as an existential threat to our mission as a public research university. So in response to that, we as ICTS formed a working group in October of 2020 to start visioning a process on how our CTSA can join UCI's Black Thriving Initiative. We spent several months meeting regularly to not only familiar ourselves with the initiative, but critically assess how the ICTS could leverage its resources to really double down on the commitment to diversity and making sure that we were doing our due diligence around increasing the diversity in clinical and translational sciences at UCI in general, moreover, especially targeting, Black students, trainees, and investigators. And I believe we ultimately drafted something that was really comprehensive, a plan that really leveraged the strengths of our CTSA, and most importantly, demonstrated our commitment to the Black Thriving Initiative and its goals. Our plans directly align with three main pillars, and they set a series of objectives that are achievable based on our local CTSA resources. And we also thought it was really important to accompany those objectives with clear milestones and metrics that I think many of you have seen us present over time. To that end, the presentation we invited today is part of that goal to tackle the second pillar, which is the culture change through personal, professional, and institutional accountability, with the specific objective of engaging the steering committee in the process of culture change. It's really important to us to nurture in our own members an understanding of the ways in which the existing culture at UCI fails to link our success to the success of Black people. In the translational realm, much of that failure is about the bias that is inherent in the ways that we think about, design, and conduct translational research, as well as how we actually train the next generation of researchers. And identifying those biases and discussing them, and then committing to implementing concrete ways of addressing those biases is a really, what we feel is a tangible way to make progress towards achieving that goal. So that's a little bit of background about why we're having the presentation today. And that being said, Dr. Schneider, I believe, is going to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Joni. Yes, so welcome, Dr. Boulware. And for those of you who aren't familiar with her illustrious career, let me give you a little snapshot. Dr. Boulware has just been named Dean of Wake Forest School of Medicine and will also serve as Vice Chief Academic Officer and Chief Science Officer of Atrium Health, which is an integrated nonprofit health system serving patients at 40 hospitals and more than 1,400 care locations. Dr. Boulware is recognized as an international leader in studying health equity, who is passionate about improving health for underrepresented minorities, especially those suffering with chronic diseases. Until she moved into this new position, Dr. Boulware directed the Duke Clinical and Translational Science Institute in Durham, North Carolina, as Vice Dean for Translational Science and Associate Vice Chancellor for Translational Research at Duke University. She was also a Distinguished Professor of Medicine and served as Chief of the Division of General Internal Medicine in the Department of Medicine at the Duke University School of Medicine. Her research has been continuously funded by NIH and PCORI and other organizations throughout her career. She's published more than 200 manuscripts, book chapters, and editorials, and has mentored numerous students, residents, fellows, and faculty members. She's an elected member of the American Society for Clinical Investigation, the National Academy of Medicine, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So in the interest of giving you more time to talk, Dr. Boulware, I'll end there and turn the virtual mic over to you.
Thank you so much. And really am really honored to be here and have a chance to have a dialogue with you, really. And I really appreciated, Joni, kind of that background that you just provided. And I'm hoping to really talk about, you talk about kind of looking for a culture change. And I'll just I just want to have a conversation here. So I'm going to say some remarks and hopefully we can just have a discussion. And I was asked to really talk about achieving diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical and translational research. I'm just going to step back into how, sort of some of the things that really struck me in recent years and why I've been passionate about these topics, but even more passionate given what's happened over the last, couple of years. So during, we'll call it the civil unrest, but the time period when the country really was kind of locked down in the pandemic, and, there was a lot of the racial tensions were really, really brewing hot. And there's, George Floyd and all the other killings that had very high profile, and sort of racism and its role in our country, structural racism just became much more under the microscope. I really began to think about what it was that my own role and what I was or wasn't doing, and what we as an organization have or have not been doing over the years to really begin to address and think about the effects of racism and structural racism and inequality on our missions. Because our mission has been in clinical and translational science to take discoveries and, from molecule all the way through population as quickly as possible to improve as many lives as possible. And it was just, as you all know, so telling that when we came to the pandemic, it was like truly remarkable. Who could have believed we would have had these vaccines emerge like in such a short time period at such a dire time? And then to see that we immediately, which many of us, who were already had been doing disparities research for so many years, but immediately saw stark disparities in the effects of the pandemic on, communities of color. And then when the vaccines came out, the vaccines didn't get taken up by those very communities that needed it. So while it was this really incredible, testament to translational science to even be at the point that we could actually get a vaccine so quickly, the latter half of the translational pathway, which is getting it to people and as many people as possible, as equitably as possible, didn't happen. It happened over time, but it was at the cost. There were at least 300,000 lives that are estimated to have been lost as a result of poor translation after the vaccines became available. And I kind of felt like these things are linked, and it's hard to link them all, but it's sort of like what the values that we have as institutions sort of drive how we think about who we want to be, whose lives we want to improve, and how we want to do it. And so I don't equate like diversity, equity, inclusion in organizations to health equity. These are two separate, but they're linked concepts. So that's kind of like a background. I think at the time that maybe this was before the vaccines even came out, but the George Floyd was going on, et cetera, I started thinking about, as a CTSI director, what's going on in the nation and what's happening. And I realized, well, I'm only one of two, I think at the time, PIs of color in this national consortium. And I started thinking about, what does that say about our country when we have a national consortium where we have very little diversity? And I think that prompted me actually to contact the steering committee for the National CTSA Consortium. That I contacted Chris Austin and the head of the steering committee, and I said, look, as one of only two people of color in this consortium as a leader, I think it's really important for us to think about what our CTSAs are doing, what we're doing as a nation in terms of promoting a culture of inclusion and equity throughout. And if we're intending to create inclusion and equity in our outcomes, we certainly should be an inclusive and equitable organization as a whole. And also had noted at the time that, much of the inclusion in terms of just the people involved in CTSAs had been around the community engagement. But a lot of the other cores across the country were not all that diverse and inclusive. And we hadn't really been making a whole lot of progress in that arena. We were starting to see more, female PIs, but really just not meeting the mark as far as I and many others were concerned. So this led to a much broader conversation about what's happening in translational science. And at the same time, major organizations were really thinking about their roles in structural racism and how can we kind of overcome this in science, and then also looking how can we link that to some of the equitable outcomes we're also seeking. So as a result of that, I was honored to be a part of an effort a couple of years ago for the national meeting, where we really sort of had, it was all virtual because it was in the midst of the pandemic, a national discussion about how to really think about moving things forward as CTSAs. First off, thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion within our organizations, and second off, thinking about how we might promote health equity through the science that we're supporting and promoting. And so got together with some other colleagues around the country, and we really started thinking and put on the national meeting and got feedback and input from folks in all the CTSAs around the country that attended that meeting, and came up with some themes. It was it was actually fairly inclusive meeting. It was all online, but we had a lot of feedback and input, and we took a lot of time to get to download input from members around the country, attendees at the meeting, to develop some themes and priorities for how we should move forward as a CTSA consortium to both improve diversity, equity, inclusion within our organizations, but also to think about how the research that we support can also improve the mandate towards improving health equity. And so we kind of came up with 4 domains that are not all inclusive by any means, but domains that we could start off with to really begin to attack as a CTSA consortium to improve diversity, equity, inclusion in clinical and translational science. And the 4 domains were leadership, training, the research itself, and then just very specifically how to engage folks, diverse individuals in clinical trials. And I think relevant to what Joni was really talking about with regard to culture, we talked a lot about leadership and training, and how do we create inclusion within our organizations that reflects the type of inclusion that we want to see elsewhere, and talked a lot about the policies and procedures that we have in terms of engaging folks in our CTSA organizations. How do we make leadership decisions? Who do we identify to lead specific activities? How do we promote a culture that's inclusive generally? We talked about training and how we can improve the inclusion of diverse individuals in our training programs, and quite frankly, kind of get over many of the traditional kind of excuses, I'd say, that there's just no pipeline, and so we just can't find people to be engaged in this space because there's no pipeline. How can we get past that? We talked about the research that gets funded at NIH, and how infrequently, unfortunately now, as a result of the same time period, there's a sea change that we're seeing at NIH. But up until that point, research focused on health inequity and health disparities was sort of relegated to a single institute, the Minority Health and Health Disparities Institute, and how we should see much more focus on inclusive and research specifically dedicated to improving health equity throughout NIH. And then also just thinking about how we can overcome, quite frankly, the mistrust and marginalization that many individuals from communities of color experience when it comes to research and engaging in clinical trials and other studies where we need that kind of engagement. And so we did take those themes and synthesize a lot of the information from the meeting and among multiple discussions that we had, and kind of came up with some principles that we put out in a perspective that was a New England Journal of Medicine, which I was glad it just got a lot of visibility, and that's exactly what we wanted, was to really do a call to action for our organizations, and really kind of challenging us to think about the policies that we have in place, whether those be micro policies, to the point of, we have a new position open, how do we go about recruiting for that position, to macro institutional policies where there are structural inequities in people's rates of promotion from rank to rank or from position to position within our organizations if it's for staff. Thinking about how to develop clear strategies to get diverse trainees, individuals from diverse backgrounds into our training programs and to foster their success. To really think about how to engage research in a different way. So far more engagement with our communities around the priorities that they think are important to improve health and health equity. And then overcoming some of our own barriers, which are both internal and external, to enhancing individuals' trust and engagement in clinical trials. And so as a result of that greater attention, the consortium has now developed a task force that reports to the steering committee around diversity, equity, inclusion, which is developing a whole longitudinal set of strategies to improve these efforts. But I'm gonna stop for a moment because I'd like to just even have some questions and comments, because one of the things I'm noticing, just even in the pictures that I'm seeing here, is that your organization appears to be very diverse. And so you've obviously been paying attention to this. And I'd love to hear, share with you some of the strategies that we're beginning to think about at Duke and how we've been approaching it. But I'd love to also hear from you and engage in a dialogue around how we can create a culture change that's both internal to our organizations, but also goes beyond our organizations, so that we're pushing the envelope in terms of improving diversity, equity, inclusion in science, in translational science. I think sometimes our programs get we are focused in our own regions, our own areas, and we may not always think about we're contributing to a national effort, and we have huge impact as a group of institutions on the direction that our nation goes with regard to science.
So, Ebony, thank you for that really fantastic introduction. And folks, if you have questions, raise your hand. I can, just so that we don't get completely disordered, raise your hand and I will go ahead and call on you. And this is not a shy group. I'm sure that people will call. But let me ask you a question. And it has to do with very much this, what's happened to you in the last couple of days is you're going from being the head of a CTSA to now being the head of the School of Medicine. What concrete things are you going to try to bring along the lines of all that you mentioned? That is, it's one thing to say we're going to recruit better, but you can't recruit better unless your own organization really reflects it. So what are some of the things you're going to try to bring as you make this transition from the leadership of the CTSA to the leadership of the School of Medicine and a large providing organization?
Thanks. One of the things that I'm really focused on for our organization will be to focus on health and health equity. Like, I almost don't want to say health without health equity next to it. That health equity becomes a really important priority, because I just cannot, but helping our organization, really every bit of our science and educational enterprise, understanding the role that we have in creating health and health equity, from basic science all the way through population health. As I think that pandemic example is just so striking to me, because we would not have gotten to a point of having vaccines had we not had folks working for decades on those discoveries that eventually would be available at the time we needed them. And so that's a huge contribution to health and health equity if people get it, but we also need that later translation. And so I'm really invested in helping everybody see the importance to improving health and improving health for all throughout the scientific enterprise. So that's one thing, is just to really help everybody see their role in it. Because I think traditionally people think about health equity and say, that's for the population and social scientists, that's way up there. And it's not just up there, it's throughout our entire enterprise. I'm also really interested in making sure that, you know, as we are teaching learners, that they also are recognizing the importance of equity and inclusion in science and medicine. I don't think we've put enough emphasis on that in the early education. I think we tend to find out about this kind of after the fact, that there are huge inequities in health. So I think it's really important to get to folks early. So that's another component. Some of it just that vision setting and that hope and expectation that the organization can take on a mindset around both health and health equity as being important outcomes for us to achieve in the biomedical enterprise. A second thing I think is really important that I'll try to invest in is our processes, because we can set the goals, as you say, Dan, but it's how you actually, the expectations you set on how to get there, that it's also really important. And there are so many aspects of how we pick and choose who's in our midst, who is lifted up in terms of their performance, who is selected for leadership positions, that we often just do without processes to ensure that we're inclusive as possible. So things that like search committees, what are our processes around that when we're selecting leaders, or when positions become available? How do we think about opening that up so it's not always a small club of individuals that are thought of and get engaged and invited to things? So that's another aspect, sort of our internal processes. Also, just I like to think about ensuring that we pay attention to that both within faculty and within staff. There are so many hurdles that folks need to get promoted to the next level in both faculty and staff, and particularly in some of the private institutions, that really some of that work to disentangle that and ensure that we have more opportunities for people who come in at entry levels to really rise the ranks, I think is really important. Another aspect is just the engagement. I don't think community engagement should be limited to CTSAs. I think community engagement is really important for institutions as a whole to take part in. And much of the mistrust that happens for historically marginalized communities are with the institutions that have the funded CTSAs. The institutions have a ton of work to do to engage and create trustworthy environments so that folks that are walking into our doors, no matter what door they walk through, feel that that we're reaching to people and we're doing that in respectful and trustworthy ways. And I always go back to, when I always think about when I've been as a CTSA director and I've been engaged with our community engaged efforts. And I almost want to say 99% out of 100 times, we'll be talking about research, and the community partner or whoever we're engaging says, well, they start talking to us about the clinic, what the health system is doing. And here it is, we're sitting here talking about research. We're all linked. So our communities really see us all as one. So I really want to bring the ethos of engagement and trustworthiness to the overall environment. Those are just some broad macro things that I'm thinking.
Other folks, I have a long list of questions, but if you could just raise your hand thing so I can see it. Questions? Okay, so I don't know what happened to this group. You've shocked everybody, Dr. Boulware. So what you were really made this great point that one of the reasons that this has come to the fore is the huge contrast that we saw between the development of a really elegant vaccine, which required tremendous basic science, and then the inability to get it out there as quickly as we possibly could. So one of the challenges, and we'd love to hear your thoughts, how do we engage the more, quote, basic scientists, end quote, or the early translational scientists into the very processes that you discussed? Is there a palpable way in which understanding the issues that you raised can improve or affect or somehow, influence the kind of research that the basic scientists do?
Well, I mean, and there are examples of this around the country where getting basic scientists in front of or in partnership with community stakeholders and community members can actually be very influential in how they think about the science that they're doing. I mean, truly basic discoveries, you know, these mechanistic discoveries, often this investigator may think, you know, they're not necessarily interested in sort of that 2 steps down the road, who's going to benefit from this. But I think getting folks at that ground level in the lab, really meeting with community members to understand the potential impact of their work on groups, and then thinking through, you know, how is what I'm doing, for example, if I'm developing some drug delivery mechanism, is this going to be relevant to diverse populations? I think there's ways that we can begin to think about science when we're engaged with the end users and our stakeholders kind of at every phase, and not thinking of it sort of as an afterthought. I don't have the answers, but I do believe that more engagement is helpful, not just for the scientists, but also for the community, because if we're going to be beginning to develop trust, folks need to see how the sausage is made. They need to understand and be educated on what is happening behind our walls. How are we developing these things? What are the processes? How do we know that this is being developed? Like for me, I mean, honestly, is when you listening to many voices from diverse communities, many folks just felt like, well, you know, was this really developed with me in mind? I'll let other folks go first for the vaccine before I go, because I don't trust it. You know, they just don't trust what we're doing. They don't understand what we're doing. And I think we're actually in a crisis right now where we have an anti-science environment in our country. We've got to figure out how to open up our walls and make ourselves more transparent and trustworthy to the population at large. I think it's both ways. So both our scientists need to understand the impact, and also the community needs to understand what we do.
Great. Joni?
I was just gonna, well, 2 comments. I was gonna kind of piggyback a little bit on what you just mentioned, Dr. Fuller. I did several presentations. So my background, my PhD is in epidemiology. So during the pandemic, I got the opportunity to do several presentations to communities, particularly African Americans, through churches and different things, just to kind of dispel, you know, many of the, you know, just the incorrect assumptions people had about the development of the vaccine. But I remember having conversations with them, and then also coming back and talking to just like colleagues in public health and different aspects. And I think one of the things that we have a issue with, I don't say an issue, but we have a tendency to do when we're on the kind of science and translational side, is to kind of take those, like, sum up those fears and basically attach them to something that happened in the past, right? And so it's never the present, it's always the past. It's like, oh, well, there's a history with the Tuskegee, and, you know, and I tell people, like, yes, that's true. I was just like, but I feel like that diffuses our own culpability and ownership over what's happening right now in our medical and our healthcare system when it comes to people of color, right? Like, there's lots of metrics that, you know, you and I and everybody else here can spew about deficiencies in our healthcare system, the way we study things that are impacting communities right now. And I feel like there's always a tendency to say, like, to other it, right? Like, oh, well, it's this history back then, as though that's not our history. That's not what's happening in the current day. And then moreover to that, I loved your comment about the kind of excuse that we get a lot of times about why we don't have more diverse communities, and the conversation about pipeline, right? And the argument I make is that, yes, you know, we may have a smaller pipeline, but the pipeline is there. And the argument, and Dan knows this, I always make, is that I just feel like the pipeline just doesn't lead to UCI, right? But there's certain universities and entities where the pipeline is just not coming to. And so instead of putting the onus again, othering it and saying, okay, what's the community or the school system that needs to be like preparing these students to come to us? It's like, I feel like we need to be doing, this is part of that cultural transformation. We internally need to be doing the work to say, why aren't we attracting these individuals, right? Why aren't they interested in coming to UCI? And what can we do to enhance the pipeline leading to UCI, as opposed to always diffusing that ownership on outside entities to prepare, you know, researchers or faculty members or students to come to UCI. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, 2 things. Great comments. Thank you. And so on the second part first, I completely agree with what you said. And I also what was resonating, what I was going through my mind as you were talking about the pipeline too, is that once people are even in our systems, how do we cultivate them for success? There are a lot of people from marginalized backgrounds that get into our systems and they drop out. Quite frankly, they're not necessarily receiving the mentoring, the kind of support, the sponsoring. And that's a failure on the part of even inside of our systems where people are already there, where the pipeline was successful in getting somebody into our system, but then are we actually cultivating their success within? So I completely agree with that. I think also the further we can reach back and pull folks in to our environments, the better, and we need to be strong about that. The second part the first part I was thinking was so relevant because we're having a discussion here at Duke, and we've got a historian, a medical historian, and somebody who does medical writing, who they were bringing up a case that was at the time national news, where there was a Black veteran that didn't receive care at Duke in like the 40s, the 30s or 40s, and this person died, and it was like a national news, et cetera, but it kind of like went by the wayside, and the family it was a national story, but I guess it kind of died down, as the stories often have. And these two, this historian and medical writer, want to do a series of, they want to elevate this story so that there could be some sort of reckoning on the part of the organization. And they were talking about it in terms of a historical perspective and trying to bring this to light. And one of the things that folks have repeatedly been saying in response to this is, well, we want to put this as if it's something that's happened in the past, but the reaction and the feeling is that it's actually reflective of what people feel are still ongoing now. So that this idea that something's in the past and it's not happening now is this way, as you said, Joni, I think, othering or kind of distancing ourselves from the problem when these problems are continually ongoing. So part of what we need to do is continually recognize that the same undercurrents that led to those things are happening in different ways and different manifestations now. So that as we're thinking about these structural inequities and these cultural issues, we have to recognize that those same forces are still there. They're just becoming evident in different ways, and we have to really watch that and really be attentive to that, so that if we're really going to make change, we continually have to sort of push on that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Dr. Ganesan.
Yeah, this is a great discussion. I had a question about maybe how you deal with this issue. So one thing that I feel in some ways is a detriment is that, academic institutions have this attitude that, oh, you train here part of the time, then you go somewhere else to train, and then we'll recruit you back, or you'll train, or we recruit people from elsewhere because, oh, if we recruit them from elsewhere, then that looks better for us. Whereas in reality, when you think about somebody that you want to develop, you develop the culture that supports diversity, equity, and inclusion. They are part of your culture and part of what you develop here. And then at some level, you're telling them that they should go somewhere else, right? And so how do we change that mentality, and what structures do you envision putting in place to promote that sort of building your own and keeping your own?
Yeah, that's a really challenging aspect, particularly when we're talking about the diversity, equity, inclusion component. And in some communities, particularly in those lab sciences, there's that culture that, like, we're going to let you go. You come and you do your postdoc, we'll let you go, then we'll recruit you back. Well, then lo and behold, when you're looking around for the people you want to recruit, you say, oh, there's nobody out there because they're all taken. And so we do need to think about how we cultivate the people's careers, and think about how we retain people long term. How do we engage, keep people on board and make sure they feel welcomed and that we want them to stay. I think that all too often, when I've seen, for example, scientists or clinicians or academic folks from marginalized backgrounds, there's often a missed synapse where people are thinking, oh, this person's fine. And this person is feeling in their environment they're not feeling welcomed or supported in certain kinds of ways. They don't have the same networks of support. They don't have the same mentoring, the same sponsoring. And so all it takes is for somebody from outside to say, hey, we want you. And all of a sudden they're saying, you know what, I'm out of here, I'm done. And they're so they're so dismayed by the time that they leave the place they've been with, that they're fine with it. But that's a loss, because the institution would hopefully have invested in that person and should continue to invest in that person to begin to cultivate, because those very people are the same ones that are going to mentor the next generation of diverse scholars. And when you don't cultivate that, you can't create more of that environment.
Great.
So that's
Dr.
my thought on
Sorkin,
it.
Dr. Sorkin, and then Dr. Ivy.
So Dan shared with us a really interesting article on developing diversity at academic health centers, and the list. And I'm looking forward to reading your paper too. But when I read the list, address work-life balance, raise the visibility, strengthen mentoring networks, build resilience, I was overwhelmed by like yes, yes, and yes. But I thought like, whoa, these are really hard problems that we've been trying to solve for a long time. And I guess I was wondering, could you share with us one or two like really cool, innovative ideas that you have, things that are bite-sized that we could start to do now? And I mean, in any of the, I mean, I know my question's sort of vague, but.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you some things that I've seen that have been successful. Some things that I've seen that have been successful. One is creating cohorts of communities of individuals who can support one another. There are some really successful models nationally of building diverse, building success among individuals from historically marginalized communities by bringing them into places where they have support of one another, as well as support of mentors and sponsors. One of the best examples of that is there's this Robert Wood Johnson, Harold Amos Minority Faculty Development Program. I don't know if any of you have been engaged with this, but this program has spun out more successful leaders and investigators from a very small group every year for, I think, probably 20 plus years. And in fact, I'm a person who was funded by that. And what it is really, you get it's like a career development award. But they put senior mentors around you. You have to have a great mentor in your institution. And then you have senior mentors from across the country that come around and provide support and insight. And then there's a cohort of other scholars that are also going through those same things, where you can then connect with these people and their shared experiences. And that's very valuable to individuals who often may feel othered in their home environments and may not feel that connection. So part of what we've tried to do at Duke too is create something similar, where we invite folks into a cohort group where they're meeting with mentors and there's support for their career development under several different sort of, no matter what their pathway is, but that they have that sort of cohorted community, so that they're feeling there's a place to really people feel like they can go and lean on when they're experiencing varying scenarios. So that's one successful thing. Another thing I want to share with you, something that we've been doing with regard to our K Awards at Duke, and really trying to spread this model, which is our goal for our K program had been to achieve at least 50% underrepresented individuals into our K program. And we've been successful in doing that year on year for at least 8 or 9 years. And they're extremely competitive. So we take all comers, but our goal has been to make sure that we get in a very diverse group to begin to address our needs at our institution of the lack of diversity in clinical and translational science. What the program noted early on was that some of the talented candidates, they didn't quite have that mentoring or that support to build up to the successful application that they might have needed, whereas others who were not necessarily who may not have been from the historically marginalized communities seem to have stronger mentoring networks, stronger sponsoring networks, and they seem to be able to navigate that whole process better. What we did was put a program in place called Recap, where it's like if a person's applied and we first give and didn't get in, we gave them feedback, and then provide them with a year's worth of mentoring to ensure they have the right mentor in place to begin to really look at their proposals and help them refine those proposals and those research plans so that they would have a ramp up time to get the program in place that would get them funded. And we have found that that has been extremely important, because we've recognized that individuals from different backgrounds often may not have those same networks or those same support systems to help them get to the successful point. So those are two ways, but I think there are lots of ways, and I'm sure you probably have some successful things at your organization as well. I think those things that we think are successful, we need to really spin them up and grow them and spread them to each other.
Autumn.
Hi, Dr. Boulware. Thank you so much for this really incredible conversation. I'm an assistant professor in pediatrics and anatomy and neurobiology. I'm also a fellow in the AMOS Medical Faculty Development Program. We just got back from the meeting a couple of weeks ago. And to your point, the community building, the belonging that is cultivated with the External Advisory Committee is unmatched. Dan Cooper is one of my mentors for that award. And so the question that I had for you is a little bit different, but I really appreciated the point that you made earlier about sometimes we get the lines crossed between trying to reach goals for health equity and also trying to reach DEI goals when they are very different but linked. And so I was wondering how you kind of make that distinction in the teams that you lead, and can you talk a little bit more about how they are linked and how they are distinct from one another, and in our groups thinking about these kind of dual efforts that we're pushing forward simultaneously?
Sure, thanks, and congratulations on being in the program. It's fantastic. So health equity research is about individuals who experience inequitable health outcomes. That is not, and I think of diversity, equity, inclusion as being something we typically, so it's often conflated with this diversity, equity, inclusion thing, which is more about often an organization or a group or an entity and how inclusive it is with regard to the identities of individuals who are in that organization. So first, it's really important to disentangle these things and see that the science that leads to health equity is something different from what's happening in our scientific enterprises with regard to the diversity, equity, inclusion of our organizations. And often, it happens to me all the time. People feel like if you do studies or research in health equity, that automatically you're some sort of expert in diversity, equity, inclusion. And that just really isn't the case. Diversity, equity, inclusion is often a focus on the human beings and how they focus. Now, we can talk about equity and inclusion in research, for example, in our research participants and how we reach out, but that's not the same thing as studying health inequity. I think we're at a point where the scholars that in health equity research are really beginning to make it clear, trying to make it clear to folks, these are not the same thing. And in fact, there was a great viewpoint on this, I think in JAMA by, I think it was Lisa Cooper and Deidre Cruz at Johns Hopkins, and they clarified this. So folks are really looking for a really great explanation of the difference between those two. I would recommend you read that viewpoint, but it is very important to separate out our study of health inequity, differences in population health based on structural and historical influences from focus on how groups of individuals can be included in an enterprise or an effort. And they're two different things. I don't know if I'm answering it well, Autumn, because I almost feel like you could probably articulate it better than I could, but I think that's, these are two separate things, and I think we often conflate them. And so we really need to be careful about that.
Thank you.
Let me call on Maritza. Dr. Salazar, you've been chatting a little bit on the chat box about some of the efforts. Maybe you could enlighten us about all the wonderful things you've been doing.
Hi, Ebony Boulware. My name is Maritza Salazar Campo, and I'm actually a faculty member at the Paul Mirage School of Business. And I have worked with Dr. O'Feely. I'm not sure if you know Dr. Elizabeth O'Feely at Morehouse, both with her Norman Seth program. I'm a PI on one of her initiatives to build out the developmental network of underrepresented scholars, really essentially training them. We say, look, you have one branch, which is your technical training, and a second, which is how you're building the constellation of people around you to be sure that you're getting the feedback you need, the sponsorship you need, and access to opportunities. We've done 5 years of this training to gather cohorts over time, and then we track the impact on their careers. And then most recently, when she was awarded the CEC First initiative, we've now brought in, I think it's 13 institutions and developed not myself, but other evaluators like Margaret Schneider that's on the call, have built empirical tools so that universities can assess whether or not they're shifting climate, shifting sense of belonging, shifting actual numerical representation on campus through the cohort model. And then the cohort 2 just came on, and we were talking about building those leadership skills at an institution to lead change, to influence stakeholders that this is a good idea, more the managerial side of the ideas are nice, but how do you make them stick, right, in our spaces of learning and education. But it's a privilege to see your own career. Congrats on your promotion. I think you're leading the way. Personally, I say another big one, we invite California Surgeon General is a Latina, Diana Ramos. We brought her to campus last week. I made the effort to make sure our prime LC and lead ABC medical students could come and break bread with her. I got so many emails saying, I'm drained in the trenches, and to just get that hour, I feel refueled and I can see what my career could be. So just as a Mexican American Chicana here, I just try to close those linkages wherever possible. So, and obviously there's champions that have been here for a long time doing the same work, but that's a recent point of pride. And I can see if I can upload the picture. The students look so happy. I don't know, Dara or others, if you got to see it, but it's really cool to see. But anyhow, that's me, and I'm happy to get to know you further.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. I'd love to hear much more about that program. And I think it just, again, reinforces this concept of the cohorting, the sponsors, the support network, the sponsorships that's needed. And then I think, I agree. I mean, I think when folks are just starting out, it means the world for them to see diverse, people from diverse backgrounds in positions that they aspire to. And so that's sort of an intangible as well. That's really important. And part of why I think that one program, the Robert Wood Johnson one that I'm talking about, is successful, because there's a lot of that National Advisory Committee is full of who's in American medicine. And we try to do the same thing at Duke, which is getting folks exposed to senior leaders, both within and outside of our institution, so that folks can really be inspired and see what's possible.
Yeah, I just want to add, Ebony, that a couple of the programs that Maritza spoke of, the Prime LC program and the Lead ABC program, they're really about, you can't talk about diversity unless you begin to become diverse yourself.
Yeah.
And you can't really address these issues until the people you're sitting with are representative of our population, and you get beyond these boundaries and you become friends and colleagues and you work together. And, this is so critical. And the Lead ABC program, for example, which was headed among others by people like Autumn and Candace Taylor Lucas, has increased the number of medical students in our school from 1 or 2 African Americans a couple of years ago to 10 or 12. Yeah. And of course, what we're doing now, and we have 100 medical students. And what that has given us as a CTSA now is an opportunity to say, well, we want you guys to join our medical student research program. So, these things just really build on one another. We're nearing the end, but I really wanted to hear from Pam. Pam is one of our great community representatives. She's was the leader of one of the most successful community organizations in Orange County to address issues of antenatal care. And she's now one of our most valued advisors, both here and nationally. And Pam, maybe you have some comments or ideas, thoughts that you had that were stimulated by Dr. Boulware.
everything you said was stimulating. I was taking various notes as you were speaking. So I've done a lot of work with Dr. Consuelo Wilkins. And so much of what you were saying is familiar, but you have an excellent way of explaining things a little bit better. So I don't really have any comments, Dan, but thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or comments? We have a couple of minutes. So the difficult question, and we started to address it, Ebony, was around the metrics and milestones that we can use for success. Because it becomes a hot buzz political issue. The word quota gets out there, and it, people get very, very passionate about this. Could you give us some idea of how we can measure ourselves in a meaningful way that we're successful in, the two ends of the spectrum? One is, are we recruiting in a way that really reflects the clinical trial and science? And two, are we becoming a welcoming organization for faculty and staff?
Well, one of the best benchmarks is, does your group reflect the populations that you serve? Do our groups reflect our populations? We had to fill out these, the CTSA sent out, the task force actually sent out a questionnaire. They were asking us, I don't know who filled it out from yours, if anybody did, but how well do you think your organization reflects the community that surrounds you? And I wasn't the first person to fill it out at our organization. Some of our team members filled it out, and I think they filled it out saying, oh, we reflect well. And I came back and I said, no, you know what? We don't reflect our community. Our community is 40% African-American, and we don't have 40% African-American in our midst. I don't think that we have to have quotas, but I think it's really important for us as organizations to say, who are the populations that we come from? Who are we serving? And are we trying to be reflective or representative of that mix and diversity in our organization? Most of what we're saying is to think about this and make it a part of the way we do things. And I think that's also true for any clinical trial. Who are the population that are going to benefit from this discovery that we're testing? Do we have that kind of diversity reflected in our trial? It's not really about quotas. It's about everybody having an opportunity to benefit from what our organizations and what our science has to offer. And I think we need to think about that even term quota and where that comes from and why that is even there. Because it just means that certain elements of the population have had greater access, more privilege. And now we're being, the concept that we're forcing a quota on inclusiveness is just, I think, a concerning concept that we need to just disavow it from our environments.
Great. Well, any comments before we close this really excellent session? Margaret, Margaret is one of our thoughtful leaders as well. Are you?
No, I didn't have anything to say other than thank you. And that was wonderful. And I hope we can embody some of what you've recommended. We already do have some programs similar to the ones that you've described, but clearly we can strengthen them. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated the dialogue, and you all got me thinking as well, especially as I'm making a transition. So I appreciated the dialogue.
So Ebony, you had been a member of our external advisory committee. You're probably going to now say that you're too busy to do that, and we understand that. But we are going to keep you on our. We're going to keep you on our phone list, and with your permission, as we engage this journey, and it was very pleasing that as you looked around this room, you saw a fairly diverse group. I think that's the effort of everybody here. Is something that we have felt is very important for our own organization. I don't think we're there yet, but I think it's a journey that we have accepted, and we're going to need your help. And we're going to need your advice and counsel. And we're so glad you took the time to talk with us. It's meaningful in so many ways. So thank you so much. And we'll give you a round of virtual applause. And we wish you well on your leadership.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Right. Take care.